أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطاهرين. Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers, and welcome to the Dictations. In today's talk, we will be discussing some etiquettes of speaking and etiquettes of speech. One of the topics that is often undermined and not really taken too seriously is the akhlaq of how to speak and how to converse. Usually when we talk about akhlaq or ethics, we are mostly concerned with our physical actions and behavior, whether we are hitting someone or whether we are, how we are behaving with people. But one of the areas where you will notice that the Quran has gives a lot of attention to, and as well as the hadith corpus gives a lot of attention to, is the etiquettes and the ethics that revolve around the tongue and how you speak and what you say and how you say it and so on. So that's what we want to look at today and look into, and dissect it a little bit from different perspectives and different dimensions. One of the things that I came across in the Kashkul of Shaykh Baha'i. Shaykh Baha'i was a scholar in Iran, and he has a kashkul. So if you recall, I in my very first ever episode that I recorded for the Dictations, I was explaining how initially I wanted to call this show the Kashkul, or the beggar's bowl. Kashkul was basically beggars would have this bowl that they would carry with themselves, and people would drop in money in those bowls. And that bowl was called the kashkul. But there was a genre of literature also called kashkul, in which scholars would just write about, they would put everything in it. It was no specific order, with no certain theme. No, it was just a bunch of stories and jokes, and sometimes hadith commentaries also appear in those books. It's just a mixture of different things. That's called the kashkul. And there are some very interesting kashkul works that have been written by different scholars. Shaykh Baha'i also has a kashkul. Shaykh Baha'i is a scholar, died in 1620, 1030 Hijri, Persian scholar, very, very well known, very, very famous. In that kashkul, he has this interesting short paragraph, this passage, he just throws it in. So this is just one entry in the kashkul. And it's about a man who talks too much. He apparently talks too much, and he talks a lot of nonsense. And then this other person is telling this individual who's talking so much, or who just talks a lot of nonsense and talks about things that are it's done with, like the issue is done with, but he's still rambling on about it. So another person tells this man, "Ey ghafil, oh heedless one, muyet be sapidi garayid va damat sar shod." Your hair is turning white, and you are just getting exhausted. But you're still busy and occupied with this qil wa qal, meaning he said this and she said this. Perhaps there, even if it's some intellectual topic, but it's done with. The time came where that topic was relevant, but now it's done with. Move on with it. But you're still obsessed with that topic, or still obsessed with that conversation. People have moved on with it. زبانت را از سخنانی که برای روز رستاخیزت نفی ندارد بازدار. Control your tongue from talking about those things that don't have any benefit for you on the day of judgment. They don't have any, these conversations, once the time is done, things have moved on, and you're still obsessing over them and talking about them and bringing discussions from the past. These discussions have no benefit for you in the hereafter, and control your tongue from it. And then there's these two lines of poetry, which I wanted to quote over here. These lines of poetry, from what I looked into it, it seems like they were inspired by the poem of another a poet whose name was Urfi Shirazi. Urfi Shirazi was a poet from Shiraz, basically from Iran, but he was invited by the Mughals in India, and he moved to India, and he was in the courts of the Mughals, and they're working very close with them, and he became a very famous poet, and eventually he died. So his grave apparently is in Lahore. So Urfi Shirazi has a poem in which these two lines of poetry also appear, but it seems either Shaykh Baha'i or someone has played around a little bit with the second line of this poem, but the first line appears in Urfi Shirazi's book of poetry. What does it say? It says, Shud khazano bulbul az qawl parishan baz mand. The summer has passed and now it's autumn, it's fall. The season has changed. And the bulbul, the nightingale, the bird, the nightingale that chirps and sings, as qawl parishan baz mand, even the bulbul has stopped singing now. The time has moved on. Even the bulbul has stopped singing and stopped chirping. But tu haman murdar morg bi mahal gui hanuz. But you are like that chicken that eats it eats the dead carcass, dead rotten animals. You are like a chicken or a rooster that eats dead meat, basically eats meat, and you don't have any. So the poetry is saying you don't have any place. You don't have any place here, but yet you're still speaking. Times have gone by, the time has passed, the seasons have changed, the bulbul is even stopped singing, but you're still trying to get trying to be involved in this conversation, whereas things have moved on. So this is a little bit of a funny poem as well. But the point of this poem is that it's addressing those people who are who get involved in discussions that are sometimes not relevant for them, or discussions that have been happening for so long and people still haven't moved on from them. This is a very common problem in some of the religious communities, because sometimes there are these discussions that pop up. Religious discussions, people have interest in them, but it's like, okay, after 10 years you're still discussing these topics and you need to move on. I remember a long time ago, discussions like the tashahhud, should you recite the tashahhud should you recite the third testimony in the tashahhud and the adhan, and these are things that really blew up around a decade ago, 2 decades ago. But still there's some people who are debating these topics and talking about them. Or in the world of polemics, there are still some discussions that are happening which when I was a kid they were happening, and it's like, okay, some of those discussions are wrapped up and there's a clear-cut conclusion on some of those polemical discussions, but still some people just want to be engaged with those topics and they don't want to move on. Some people don't want to move on and address the more contemporary issues that Muslims are facing. They're just not bothered. So this poem is for them, because the world has moved on. The summer is finished. There's a season of fall. The autumn is here. And even the bulbul has stopped chirping, but you're still discussing those old topics. And that's what this poem is trying to get at. But the crux of this is that, look, speaking itself has a lot of etiquettes. When you want to talk and speak about something, there are a bunch of etiquettes that are good to follow. And they are, they will make your speech more beautiful. And they will make your presence in a gathering more beautiful. In the modern era, there's a couple of qualities that the modern era has that makes speaking and uttering nonsense very, very attractive. And one of those things is that speaking itself on its own has a lot of merit. Meaning, the more you speak, that act itself has a lot of merit. And so everyone speaks. And everyone speaks about as many topics as they possibly can. People want to poke their nose and have an opinion on everything, and they want to say this opinion out loud as well. Whereas in the traditional sources, when you look at the, let's say you look at the hadith corpus, you're going to notice that no, the merit is for the one who remains silent, not the one who speaks. And this is a contradiction between the traditional paradigm and the modern paradigm, where the modern paradigm sees speaking in and of itself as a merit. And what that leads to is a lot of nonsense being spoken about. A lot of things where, people are speaking where they mean absolutely nothing. Okay, they don't mean anything. And by nonsense, we mean speech where an individual is not concerned with the objectivity around it. They're not concerned, they say things without any regard for truth. Doesn't care if what they're saying is true or false or reliable or not reliable, whether they only care about the listener being convinced of what they're saying. So that's what we mean by nonsense here. And because the merit is in the one who speaks the most, then therefore there's this tendency to speak a lot, and therefore you're not going to be very conscious of the etiquettes that are also mentioned or that are required to speak. Another reason why a lot of people speak nonsense is because this idea of everybody's opinion matters. Well, that's not always correct. There are many places where some people's opinions literally does not matter at all. But yet, because we live in this world where, no, we try to say that everybody's opinion matters on every topic. Well, in that situation, what you're going to end up promoting is this culture of everybody just, encourages everyone to say something without really looking at the status of who this individual is, the credibility of who this person is, where are they from, what are their expertise, what have they studied, so on and so forth. And a third reason why there's a lot of speech without etiquette, without any proper, etiquettes to it, is the fact that in the modern world, we prefer quantity over quality. This is one of the qualities of the modern paradigm, that you prefer quantity over quantity. And many works have been written about this subject as well. Whereas in the traditional paradigm, including in the Quran itself, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that Allah tests you to see, who is ahsanu amala, who is better in their actions, instead of saying aktharu amala, instead of saying who does more actions, who does more good deeds. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says who does the better deeds, whose quality of those deeds are better. He doesn't care about who is doing more deeds. Quantity didn't matter. Whereas in the modern paradigm, quantity is very important. So the more you can speak, the more you can say stuff, it impacts that as well. And of course, this is also linked to our earlier dictations, where we talked about ujub and narcissism and conceit. When you are in love with yourself, you want to be heard. You want to be the one who people look up to, and you want to be the one whose voice is everywhere. That's something that ends up happening. So that's a kind of intro I wanted to give about this subject. What are some of the etiquettes that you can actually follow when it comes to speaking? Does the Quran say anything about this, or do we have any analysis about what are some of the etiquettes of speaking? When you look at the Quran, you're going to find a number of qualities being mentioned. Sifat, adjectives, if you want to call them. Adjectives and characteristics for the word qawl, meaning speech. And we're going to get to those adjectives, what they are. But you can dissect speech from a couple of different dimensions and then expand on it. And I will leave these dimensions with you, and you can think about them yourself further. But you can look at speech and kalam from different dimensions, from different perspectives. The very first perspective that you can look at speech from is from the perspective of the content itself. Is what you are saying true, or is it not true? What exactly is being said? And what this means is that before you say something, you should be sure about what you are saying. Meaning, you should be sure that what you are about to say is actually the truth. You don't want to say things which are firstly false. You shouldn't be lying. Or you should not be saying things you are unsure about. Unless you say it in a way where the audience understands that you are unsure about it. So the content of what you are, so the first dimension you can look at speech from is as the content itself. What is the content that is being said? What are you actually saying? Is what you are saying true? Is it correct? Is it authentic? Or are you just saying nonsense, basically? Just for the heck of it, for whatever other intentions that you have. And you're going to notice that in the seminary, what we know, at least what I noticed, or any student will notice, is that there is this constant culture of adding the word maybe and perhaps it seems like this, it appears to be the case. And this is a very predominant culture in the way scholars engage with any topic. So when they are unsure about something, when they don't have yaqeen and qat', as they say, is when they don't have certainty on a matter, they try not to present it as a matter of certainty. Particularly, I'm talking about in the world of scholarly discussions. They don't talk about things in absolute certainties when they're not sure about it. So you're going to see a lot of maybe, perhaps, it seems this is the argument, it seems this is what the narration is saying, it seems like this is what the ayah means, and this becomes part of their culture. And in the beginning, it was very frustrating, because when you're reading these discussions, you want to learn what the ulama's opinions are on whatever topic, and you start seeing these phrases like maybe, perhaps, it appears. You're trying to figure out, like, okay, what's your answer at the end of the day? What's your conclusion? And then you realize, maybe the alim or the scholar or the researcher hasn't reached a conclusion, and this is what they think. They think this is, the best attempt that they can make to get to a conclusion, and that's how they are phrasing it as well. They don't want to say and give present the content in a way where someone might think that they are affirming this piece of information with 100% certainty. So they're very, very careful. I remember back in 2016, I think it was, there's the madrasa in Qom called Madrasa Gul Paygani. It's near the shrine, and this is the famous Madrasa Gul Paygani, where they say that you're not allowed to teach philosophy and mysticism and so on. So it's a very well-known madrasa in Qom. Over there was a scholar by the name of Sayyid Alam al-Huda. Sayyid Alam al-Huda, this Sayyid Alam al-Huda is from the very famous family of Alam al-Huda. Alam al-Huda is a very famous family of scholars in Iran. This is one of the a family member from that family, one of the individuals from that family. He was giving Bahth al-Kharij, which is the advanced discussions in fiqh and usul, where you're learning how to do ijtihad technically. And anyways, he was giving these topics about is it necessary to do taqleed of the most learned? And I have these transcriptions on Iqra Online. So in one of those discussions, I believe it was the third one or the fourth discussion, he said something very interesting, and I remember when I was listening to him. He says that people who are less knowledgeable claim certainty much more than those people who are more knowledgeable. Meaning, the more knowledgeable you get, the less certainty you're going to have about certain things. Why is that? Because the more knowledgeable you get, the more possibilities and dimensions you can begin to see about any given phenomenon. Right? So let's say you have a narration in front of you, and if your knowledge is less, your knowledge is very basic, you may read a narration and say, well, this narration means X, Y, Z. But the more your knowledge increases, and let's say you learn about the history of that narration, you learn about the history of that time, that you know about the seerah of the Imam or the Prophet, then when you read a narration, you can start looking at other dimensions, other possible meanings that can have. And eventually, you're not going to be so sure about what that narration meant. So the more knowledgeable you get about certain things, the less yaqeen you also get at the same time about certain things. But when your information is so little, the calculations that you are making about things are so, based on just two variables, well, yes, you're going to claim certainty about things very easily. And that's something that becomes a problem when you speak and when you transmit information. You transmit information with so much certainty, and the audience can get deceived at that point. And that's something that is one of the very basic etiquettes of speech. Where that is, when you're speaking about anything, make sure you say it in a way where the audience understands. Is this something that, what you're saying right now, is this something that you are certain about? Is this a certain piece of information, or is this speculative piece of information? What is it at the end of the day? If it is speculative information, well, then present it in a way where it sounds speculative. Don't present it in a way with 100% certainty. If it is 100% certain, then don't present it in a speculative way where there's room for doubt and error. No, if something is certain, then say it in a way where it's certain. So that's something that is very, very important. It's part of the adab of speaking. adab of kalam, how to even speak properly. A second dimension then you can look at speech is the place and the audience, right? So you want to make sure that, yes, sometimes the content is correct, the content is true, but the place where you're saying it, it may not be appropriate at that time. And this is a very basic understanding, and it's a custom that not every truth needs to be said necessarily, right? There's a time and place for everything. So what do we mean? Sometimes, let's say, God forbid, somebody's parent passes away, and you just watched a World Cup final, and you're very happy about the World Cup final. Your favorite team won the match, and now you go to your friend's house, and their parents have just passed away, and you go to their home and you tell them, Argentina has won the World Cup, and you start celebrating. Well, look, you just told the truth, and you are very certain about it as well. The content is correct, but the place was not appropriate. The place was not good. It was the wrong time for you to bring this up. Likewise, in our own religious communities, this is a very common thing that happens every year. The topic of zanjir and tatbir and blood matam and these type of discussions always pop up. And the question is it really the appropriate, is the appropriate time to bring it up is the month of Muharram, or no, should you be talking about these topics for the rest of the year? Why do you have to bring it up in Muharram when everybody knows people's emotions are, charged? People are very, very emotional. Of course, you're not going to achieve the purpose that you want to achieve. It's very common. It's very common sense. If you're going to talk about a sensitive topic where people are attached to it, and you're going to talk about it in Muharram when people are already so emotionally charged, well, you know what's going to happen to you then. People are not going to listen to you. People are not going to, care about what you're saying. But you have the entire year to talk about those topics, discuss with those people, so on and so forth. This is, a very basic example of making sure that the place, the audience who you're speaking to, you take them into consideration. Okay, because if the place is not right, well, then your speech can anger them. It can, when you're not intending to anger them, it can overexcite them when you're not intending to make them excited, right? So these are some of the examples of what can happen if the place of your speech is not correct. If you're speaking the truth but in a wrong place. Another dimension from which you can look at speech from is the tone of your language. So if you are, let's say, your tone can be angry, you can be sarcastic, you can be trying to be funny, you can be condemning someone, you can be trying to show respect, you can be sad. All of these are different tones that you must use in your kalam, in your speech. When you're speaking to someone and you are angry, well, then you better show it in your tone that you're angry. If you are angry but you're showing it, but your tone is just very, happy, well, the audience is not going to understand that you're angry. They're going to misinterpret you. They're going to misread you. And hence why the tone is very, very important. Sometimes there are people who you can't even tell. Are you angry? Or are you sad? Are you happy? I can't figure out from your tone. Have some tone. Put some tone in your voice. If you're being sarcastic, then it's important to say it in a tone where that sarcasm is being expressed. Sometimes people, might take you seriously. I remember, I believe last year or 2 years ago, or was it 2 years? I'm not sure. Whenever Clubhouse came out. Remember when Clubhouse came out, became a huge thing in the first couple of months, and it blew up. Anyways, on Clubhouse there was a group, and some people were chatting about some Shia Sunni issues, and I came up and I said some remarks, and there was a guy who was just, he started to call me out, but didn't know who I was. He knew who I was, but didn't realize who I was on in that group. And funny enough, they started to message me privately, asking me some responses to whatever I was saying in that club, in that group. So I told them that was me. So they felt a little bit embarrassed, and then the way they were apologizing, the apology didn't seem sincere. Meaning, even they could have been sincere, I don't know, but the tone of their apology didn't sound sincere at all. And that's because, the tone was just almost like, sounded like like he was being sarcastic. So these are important things to understand and keep into consideration when you are having conversations with people, when you want to maintain relationships with people, when you want to discuss things with people. These things can all trigger problems. If your tone is not correct, if your place is not correct, if your content is not correct, well, then you can create problems. If the content is false, well, you just deceived an entire community, for example. If the place was not correct, or the time and the place was not correct, well, you told the truth, but you ended up doing certain damage, for example. Maybe those two were perfectly fine, but the tone that you used was such that the individual or the audience misunderstood you. The tone also has to be there. If you're trying to apologize, well, you should sound apologetic. You should sound like you're apologizing. You shouldn't sound sarcastic at that point. So that's something that is important. That was basically a third dimension from where, how you can analyze speech and kalam, your own kalam we're talking about. A fourth dimension from where you can analyze speech is we would call it the framework. Is your speech an academic speech? Is it long? Is it short? Is it, concise? Is it, in which language are you speaking? In the sense that, is this language for elementary school students? Is it a speech for, is it a kalam for university students? This is also extremely important, and this is a problem for many people have. Some people don't know how to wrap up their point in 5 minutes. A point can be said in 2-3 minutes, but they're going to take 30 minutes to get their point across. Or sometimes you're supposed to give a 40-minute lecture, but you've ended it in 10 minutes because you don't have anything to say. And this is something that is important. Knowing, what type and what length to use in what context. Sometimes in the masajid, some people come and you expect them to only speak 3 minutes, 4 minutes, but they end up speaking 20 minutes, 15 minutes. And people get tired, people get exhausted, because that's just not the thing. Some people are unable to read the audience. They're unable to read the room. Look, people are tired, for example. It's late night. We just want to hear a 5-minute thing from you. We don't want to hear 20-minute speech from you. Some people are unable to do it, and we experience this ourselves in the mosques, in the community centers at times, or in our work places, where some people are just unable to do that. But that's part of the etiquettes of speech. You should know, you should learn how to figure these things out. Some people, for example, when they are giving a speech in the mosque with the awam, they start throwing in academic terms. Well, half the crowd doesn't even know what you're talking about at this point. I experienced this one time from a very, it seems like he was a popular Urdu speaker, and my Urdu is pretty fluent, but you don't understand him. Because his Urdu that he's speaking is just some next level Urdu, some next level formal Urdu that even most of the adults also don't understand. So what's the point? You're just wasting people's time at that point. Or sometimes you lack the vocabulary so much that you can't even express yourself. So look, it's important to know the vocabulary, but it's also important to know which vocabulary to use in which circumstance, in which situation. All of these things are important. All these things are important. So content, what you're saying, is it the truth? Have you researched it? Are you 100% sure about it? And if you are not sure about it, then are you saying it in a way where you're deceiving the audience? Or are you saying it in a way where the audience understands that you are unsure about this information? So content is important. Second is the place. Who is the audience? Who are you communicating with? Third is the tone. Is the tone of your voice clear? Are you giving us, are you angry? Are you happy? Are you sad? Are you condemning someone? What is the tone of your kalam? And the last one is the framework. This framework, by the way, it gets tough as well. Imagine how tough it gets for speakers. Let's say in Muharram or in any, in our majalis. You, as a speaker, are expected to speak for an audience where you have elementary school students, you have middle school students, you have high school students, you have university students, and then you have working class people, and then you have adults and seniors, both men and women. That is a extremely diverse audience, and you are expected to give a speech in a way where all of these people are taken into consideration. That's very, very tough, and to an extent it may even be an unreasonable expectation. Hence why sometimes when I give my seminars and speeches, in the beginning I always clarify that what I'm about to say, or the speech that I'm about to give, is for a university audience, or is for an audience which is, let's say, 18 to 35 years old, or 18 to 40 years old. Because even after 40, 50 years old, there are certain audiences, certain communities that are not going to be able to understand, my English or the vocabulary I'm using, and so on. So that's just based on my knowledge of that community. Different communities are going to differ. But that's very, very important. That's why it makes it very difficult to sometimes give a speech which is productive and has a meaningful impact for the community, because you have to speak at an audience level. Obviously, you're going to have to take the lowest level of the audience over there. Perhaps a high school level, high school, maybe middle school, let's say. And that's the level where many speakers are going to have to speak at, because you don't want to ignore that crowd, and you don't want to ignore the older crowd either, because they're also coming to your lecture and to your speech. So you're going to end up having to speak in a very in a framework that somehow considers all of these people. That's something to think about. Is that even possible? Is that how we should continue? Our because these places are places where knowledge is being transmitted, and is that how you want to continue transmitting knowledge for the next generation in these formats, or no? Is this something that we should think about? Now, if you look at the Quran, you notice the Quran actually gives, as I had mentioned earlier, it uses terms for qawl. It gives adjectives for qawl, different types. And that's how you're going to, and the interesting thing is the adjective or the sifa is relevant to the context of where that qawl is where that speech is being given. For example, when you look at the dimensions of these 3-4 dimensions that we've mentioned, if you look at one of the ayat of the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ صِدْقًا وَعَدْلًا, that the word of your Lord has been perfected in sidq and adl. Sidq is the content, it's truth, and adl is justice, so the place. Meaning the word of your Lord, the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, has been perfected from the two dimensions. The dimension of the place, it's a just kalam, and from the dimension of the content, it is a true kalam. Or for example, وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ الْحُسْنَى, that the word of your Lord has been completed, and it's al-husna. This kalam is al-husna. It's a good kalam, meaning it's referring to the framework. It's a kalam which is, perfectly relevant for the audience that is, approaching it. Sometimes it's concise, sometimes it's long, sometimes it's complicated, sometimes it's simple, sometimes it uses metaphors, sometimes everything is in it for the audience, for the different audiences that are going to approach it. وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ الْحُسْنَى, the kalam of Allah has been completed, has been perfected in its goodness. That's something that is there. And then you have other command tenses in the Quran as well. وَإِذَا قُلْتُمْ فَعْدِلُوا, when you speak, do adala, have adal in your speech. So make sure the place and time and place of it is correct. قُولُوا لِلنَّاسِ حُسْنًا, say things to people in a good way. The framework of what you're saying should be good. Or قُولَ لَهُ قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا. This is, inshallah, we'll get to this in a bit. It's talking about Prophet Musa and Harun when they were going to approach Fir'aun. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling them to speak to Fir'aun in a layyin way, meaning in a lenient way. Which is interesting. That itself is a different dictations on its own. Why is Allah asking the prophets to speak to Fir'aun, the tyrant, the transgressor, in a way which is very lenient? Of course, some of it you may be able to understand it, because Fir'aun, Musa is the one who, Musa was brought up in Fir'aun's place. And ultimately, now that they're going to Fir'aun, you don't want to go so harsh. You want to try and attract this individual. So you're going to have to speak leniently. Anyways, that's a whole different discussion. But look at some of the qualities that are mentioned in the Quran. One quality that is mentioned. There are at least 8-9 qualities mentioned in the Quran, or adjectives as we say, sifat. You have qawlan sadida. Okay, qawlan sadida means qawl which is appropriately just, appropriate justice. And this is being used for who? Is being used for the guardians of orphans. So the guardians and the caretakers who are taking care of the orphans, Allah is asking them, to speak to other people, speak to the children and to the orphans in a just way. وَلْيَقُولُ قَوْلًا سَدِيدًا. Speak in a way which is just. Don't speak to them in a way which is unjust. Or another ayah in the Quran, it says قَوْلًا ثَقِيلًا. Qawl which is very, very heavy. And this is used for the wahi that was revealed on the Prophet. Revelation is a kalam of Allah. That qawl is not some easygoing thing. It's a thaqeel qawl. It's a heavy qawl on the Prophet. It's a heavy burden. It's a heavy responsibility on the Prophet. And this is used for revelation. Or Allah says qawlan baligha. Speak in a eloquent way. And this is for being effective against the hypocrites and the disbelievers. So look, these are different aspects of the qawl. Sometimes you gotta use qawlan sadida, sometimes you gotta use qawlan thaqila, sometimes you have to use qawlan baligha. Sometimes you gotta use qawlan ma'rufa. Qawlan ma'rufa, one of the places it is used is for the wives of the Prophet who are asked to speak to the companions in qawlan ma'rufa. Speak to them in a ma'ruf way, meaning a way which is befitting of your reputation in society, of your nobility and your dignity. Speak to them in a noble way, qawlan ma'ruf, or in a good way, qawlan ma'rufa. Or there's an ayah that says qawlan yasira. Speak in a easy way for the simpletons, for the laymen. Some of the awam, they are very simple-minded. Speak to them in a very simple way. Qawlan karima. Qawlan karima means a qawl which is dignified and noble. Use noble words for your parents. Right? So this qawlan karima is used in context of speaking to your parents. Qawlan layyina we already addressed. Qawlan layyina is when Allah is asking Musa a.s. to speak to the Fir'aun in a lenient way, because initially you're going to try and give this Fir'aun some advice. And for that you don't want to be harsh. You want to take it easy. Or you have qawlan azima. Qawlan azima is Allah is accusing the mushrikeen who are saying or who are making false accusations against the Prophet and making false accusations about the Quran. So Allah said this is a qawlan azima. This is an outrageous attribution, outrageous claim that you are making. Or you have qawlan qalu salama. When the jahilun speak to you, when the jahil people speak to the prophets, they say salam, words of peace, and they move on from them. These are a couple of qualities of qawl mentioned in the Quran. So you can see it's a pretty, it's a topic that is prevalent in the Quran. And some of these qualities are mentioned multiple times, right? Qawlan ma'rufa, qawlan husna, and so on. Qawlan, fa'adilu, right? Or adlan. These are mentioned a couple of times, not even one time. So you see, qawl is mentioned quite a lot of times in the Quran. And the qualities of it and the different dimensions of it are very, very, you can observe them in the Quran. And what's very much more interesting is that you can see that depending on the context, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses a very different type of quality for it as well. One final case study, or not case study, just to show you it's an ishara to the etiquettes of speech. We're going to look at a very, the most famous instance of a dialogue or some sort of a conversation in the Quran is the dialogue between Prophet Musa a.s. and Khidr, right? Khidr, whether he was a prophet or not, there's a joke in the Hawza. There's a joke that they say that the mystics, they make fun of they make fun of us, and they say you guys are still arguing and debating whether Khidr was a prophet or was he just a normal human. You're still arguing over this. Whereas us, the mystics, the Urafa, we're arguing whether Khidr was even a human or not. So, it's kind of like they're making fun of the rest of us, saying you guys are still, discussing whether Khidr was a prophet or was he somebody else. What was this individual? They're saying we're trying to figure out whether this guy was even a human. So that story in the Quran, and obviously we know Khidr is not even mentioned by name in the Quran, which is interesting. But in Surah Al-Kahf, when you open up those ayat of Khidr and Musa, so this is the end of the story. And I just quoted some of the ayat here just to kind of show you guys. Obviously, inshallah, I hope everybody knows the story, which is, Musa alayhi salam is accompanying this man, this righteous, pious servant of Allah. And this man says to Musa, this man is apparently Khidr. So he says to Musa, don't interrupt me when you're accompanying me, because I'm going to do certain things and I don't want to hear your interruptions. So Musa says, yes, that's fine. But at every action, he basically, Musa alayhi salam questions him. Khidr kills a boy, so Musa questions him. Khidr makes a hole in one of the ships or the boats that belong to poor people, and so on. So now Khidr is now giving the answers. Why did I do this? So in ayah 79, he says that Safina. He says, as for the boat or the ship, أما السفينة فكانت لمساكين يعملون في البحر فأردت أن أعيبها وكان وراءهم ملك يأخذ كل سفينة غصبا. It says, as for this boat or this ship or the ark, it belonged to some poor people who used to work on the seashore. So I wanted to make it defective. I wanted to ruin it and damage it, because there was a king across the sea who was just waiting for people to come, and he was stealing people's boats. Okay? So that's the first ayah. Khidr is saying, I damaged the boat because there was a king that was waiting, and he would have taken the boats from them. And later on, these guys could have fixed it. They can fix it themselves. Then he says in ayah 80 or 81. Well, ayah 80, which I didn't put over here. Ayah 80 is explaining that basically this boy would have convinced his parents to become disbelievers. And, he would basically make them disbelievers. So ayah 81, it says, فَأَرَدْنَا أَن يُبْدِلَهُمَا رَبُّهُمَا خَيْرًا مِّنْهُمْ زَكَاةً وَأَقْرَبَ رُحْمًا. So Khidr is saying, so we hoped or we wanted that their Lord would replace this child with a better child. So we wanted that their Lord should substitute for them a child that is better than the one that they currently had. Better from what perspective will this child be better? From the perspective of his piety and purity, and from his mercy he would be more caring, basically. So if you look over here, it says فَأَرَدْنَا. In the first and the ayah in the top, it says I wanted to damage the ship. Okay, it says فَأَرَدْتُ. I wanted to damage the ship. This one says فَأَرَدْنَا. We wanted. This is what we wanted to do. And then the next ayah is about the story where Khidr came to this town and there was a wall that was it was already damaged, and Khidr basically fixed the wall. And Musa alayhi salam says, you could have charged some money for this work. Why did you just do this work for free? So now Khidr is explaining. He says, look, as for that wall, it belonged to 2 orphan boys in the city. وَكَانَ تَحْتَهُ كَنْزٌ لَهُمَا. There was a treasure that belonged to them underneath that wall. And their father was a righteous person. فَأَرَادَ رَبُّكَ أن يبلغ أشدهما ويستخرج كنزهما رحمة من ربك. Your Lord wanted these children to become baligh and to become of age, and then they can go and retrieve the treasure themselves, and this was a mercy from your Lord. This is very, very interesting. In the same conversation with Musa alayhi salam and Khidr, Khidr is changing the pronouns on the verbs 3 times. On the first time he says فَأَرَدْتُ أَنْ أَعِيبَهَا, I wanted to damage the ship. Then he says فَأَرَدْنَا أَنْ يُبْدِلَهُمَا رَبُّهُمَا, we wanted that his Lord changes this child with a better child. And then the wall situation, he says فَأَرَادَ رَبُّكَ أَنْ يَبْلُغَ أَشَدُّهُمَا وَيَسْتَخْرِجَ كَنْزَهُمَا رَحْمَةً مِّن رَبِّكَ, that your Lord wanted these boys to grow up and then retrieve the treasure from underneath. Otherwise, because the wall was about to fall, if it had fallen, people in the city would have just stolen their wealth that their father had left for their children. Okay. What I want to show here is that look at the adab and the etiquettes of how Khidr, or this righteous servant, is speaking when about these actions. In real life, Khidr, or this righteous servant, is the one who is physically doing all of these things. He physically damaged the ship, he physically killed the boy, and he physically, built the wall. But when it comes to speaking, he attributes the act which is very negative, he attributes it completely to himself. So the damaging of the ship, he damaged the property, obviously. He says, فَأَرَدْتُ أَنْ أَعِيبَهَا, it was I decided to do it. I decided to damage it. Okay, I decided to damage this boat. As for the child who was killed, but the return on that was that they were going to get a better child. The parents were going to get someone better. So it has 2 perspectives. There's a negative perspective, which is that, the boy was killed. And then there's a second perspective that the parents were going to get something better in return. So Khidr says, فَأَرَدْنَا, we, meaning me and our Lord, we decided. So it's almost as if he's attributing the negative aspect to it to himself, and the good aspect of it he's attributing to Allah. And he says, so we decided that their Lord will replace that child with someone better. And in the last one, which is an act which is just good, he rebuilt the wall. Over there, Khidr does not even take any credit for it. He says, فَأَرَادَ رَبُّكَ, your Lord decided for this to happen. And this is a very, very, it's the precision of the Quran. In these type of ayat, it becomes very clear. It becomes it's very beautiful. And you begin to see how profound it actually is. I'll just keep it up for those who want to look at it a bit more closely, but obviously you can look at the Quran itself. You can notice the precision of the Quran, how it is, or it is at least showing us how you should speak to about your Lord. I remember when we were still learning Farsi, I think it was our 2nd or 3rd book. So I think you have to study 5-6 books of Farsi when you're learning Persian early in the Hawza. I remember when we were still learning it, and we gave a test, and one of the teacher made a error in marking the paper of one of the students, Pakistani student. And usually the Pakistani students, when we don't know a Persian word, we just throw in an Urdu word, and 80% of the time is usually correct. So, but 20% of the times is not correct. 20% of the time it has a different meaning or a different connotation. So the teacher made a mistake in marking the paper, and this Pakistani student, he says to the teacher, "Agha, ghalat kardid," right? And ghalat just in Urdu just means wrong, like you made a mistake. That's what it means in Urdu. So what he said in Urdu sounded perfectly normal, but in Farsi, the connotation of that phrase is extremely rude, right? And the teacher was kind of taken back a little bit, and he realized that this Pakistani student just threw in an Urdu word thinking that it has the same connotation, but it does not have the same connotation. It has a very rude connotation in Farsi. And that too, if you are saying it to your teacher. And the teacher then said, look, it is more appropriate and it is part of your etiquette, is, the adab of saying, if you want to say that, if you want to let the teacher know that there's a mistake, the better way of saying it is, Agha zahiran ishtibah shode. Ustad, it seems like there has been a mistake that has happened. So what you're doing there is that you are not attributing the mistake to the teacher. You're just saying it seems the mistake has happened. Now, yes, you believe the teacher made a mistake over here, but the etiquettes, and this is part of the, you can't even say this is just part of Persian culture or Pakistani culture. Look, this is the Quran's culture. The Quran, the ayat of the Quran, as we showed, are demonstrating that, look, how you're supposed to speak to about people. Well, the Quran is saying about how to speak about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but over here, when you look at the ahadith, you look at the significance of your parents and significance of your teachers, it's the same principle that is applied. How you speak to them and how you speak about them, it becomes very, very important. There is a degree of etiquette that you must maintain over there. And this is the tradition that unfortunately we have lost in the current day and age. We don't have any, there's no such thing as respect for teachers anyways. It's finished. But yet the Quranic paradigm and the Islamic paradigm, the traditional paradigm, pushes this, that no, you should show respect for your teacher. And more importantly, as we were talking about it in this lesson, respect in your kalam, the way you speak to them, the way you speak about them. And that story at the end, I just wanted to wrap it up with that, because it was a very profound experience for me, right? Because coming from the West, going to Iran, and even though I grew up in the Middle East, I was used to that type of respect, showing that type of respect. We would stand up when we were answering questions, but when we moved to the West and we lived for a long time, I had forgotten those etiquettes. But going back in and sort of experiencing that again, it was very, very profound learning experience for me. Like, oh wow, there is this element of respect. You can't just tell your teacher, teacher, you messed up. You can't say that. It's considered extremely rude, and it's almost not just disrespecting the teacher. You are disrespecting yourself. At the end of the day, you are a student of this teacher. So why would you want to, say these type of remarks to them? Instead, in that situation, we were told that it's better to say, teacher, it seems there's a mistake that has happened. And that is enough for the teacher to realize that, let me go revisit my marking error. So anyway, I just wanted to end with that. And I hope today's discussion opened up these other dimensions of speech, and how speaking, something that we take for granted, has a lot of attention that has been given to it in the Quran. And honestly, when you look at the traditions and you look at the ayat and the riwayat, you notice even the ahadith tradition, there's a lot of focus on the tongue, controlling your tongue. Well, this is what it's talking about. Look at the different dimensions. Look at the content, look at the place, look at your tone, look at the framework, how you're speaking. Is it a good speech? Is it, the different characteristics and the qualities we went through that are mentioned in the Quran? All of those things should be taken into consideration before you utter something. And of course, if you cannot take all that stuff into consideration, then as the tradition says, silence is far better for you in that circumstance, in that situation. Anyways, I hope today's discussion was interesting, and please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And if you have any comments, feedback, constructive criticism, please feel free to drop them. Make sure to follow the etiquettes of speech when you're doing that. And I will see you all in a future video, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.